On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, an explosion ripped through Reactor 4, releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. The disaster unfolded in a matter of seconds, but its consequences would last for generations. What was meant to be a routine safety test turned into one of the worst nuclear accidents in human history, a catastrophe so severe that its effects are still being felt today. The Chernobyl power plant was part of the Soviet Union's push for nuclear energy, a symbol of technological progress. Located near the city of Pripyat, the plant housed 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction at the time of the disaster. Reactor 4, the one that would explode, had been in operation for just 3 years. The plant used RBMK reactors, a Soviet design that had serious flaws that were ignored for the sake of rapid expansion. The accident occurred during a late-night test meant to determine whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. To conduct the test, operators disabled several key safety systems, something that should never have been done under normal conditions. Due to a combination of human error, poor reactor design, and a lack of proper safety protocols, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A sudden power surge led to 2 massive explosions, blowing off the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid. Flames shot into the night sky, and within moments, a deadly cloud of radioactive material was released. The force of the explosion was so powerful that pieces of the reactor were hurled across the plant grounds. Firefighters, unaware of the radiation exposure, rushed to the scene to battle the flames. Many of them had no protective gear, and within minutes of arriving, they began experiencing severe symptoms of radiation poisoning, dizziness, vomiting, and intense burns. The graphite from the reactor core burned fiercely, and as the fire raged, radioactive particles were carried by the wind, spreading across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet government initially downplayed the severity of the explosion. Pripyat, a city built to house the plant's workers and their families, was not immediately evacuated. For over 36 hours, residents continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played outside, families attended school and work, and life went on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until radiation levels spiked in Sweden nearly 1,000 miles away that the world realized something was terribly wrong. By the time the Soviet government acknowledged the disaster, the damage had already been done. Pripyat was finally evacuated on April 27th, but by then thousands of people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Buses lined the streets as residents were ordered to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry. Many never returned. The city, once a thriving community, became a ghost town overnight, abandoned in a desperate attempt to escape the invisible threat that lingered in the air. As the Soviet authorities scrambled to contain the disaster, the full scale of what had happened was only beginning to be understood. The explosion had not just devastated the reactor, it had created an ongoing crisis that would require massive resources and human sacrifice to control. The response in the days and weeks ahead would determine how much worse the situation would become, and for those who remained at the plant, the danger was far from over. In the chaotic hours following the explosion at Reactor 4, Soviet officials struggled to grasp the full extent of the disaster. The immediate priority was to extinguish the raging fires and prevent further explosions, but the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. With radiation levels climbing to lethal amounts, every decision carried life or death consequences. The first responders, many of whom were local firefighters, had unknowingly walked into a death trap. They had been called to the scene, believing it was a routine industrial fire, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Without protective gear, they fought the flames with water, completely exposed to the intense radiation streaming from the destroyed reactor core. Within hours, many of them began experiencing severe symptoms: nausea, dizziness, and painful burns. Caused by radiation penetrating their bodies, some collapsed on the spot. Despite their suffering, they continued working, trying desperately to contain the disaster. Meanwhile, inside the control room of Reactor 4, plant workers struggled to understand what had happened. Many refused to believe that the reactor had exploded. It was not just denial, it was the result of years of Soviet propaganda promoting the idea that their reactors were completely safe. Some operators were ordered to manually pump cooling water into what was left of the core, exposing themselves to deadly radiation in the process. Others tried to restore power to the plant, unaware that their efforts were futile. The damage had already been done. As news of the explosion spread among Soviet leadership, there was hesitation about how to respond. The government's instinct was to cover up the severity of the situation. Officials debated whether to alert the public or keep the disaster a secret, fearing international backlash and damage to the Soviet Union's reputation. While these discussions took place behind closed doors, people in Pripyat continued their daily routines, completely unaware that invisible radioactive particles were already settling over their city. Radiation levels in and around the plant were astronomical. Readings on dosimeters, devices used to measure radiation exposure, quickly maxed out. Some devices even failed entirely due to the extreme radiation. Despite this, government officials were reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the catastrophe. Scientists who raised concerns were ignored or silenced. And it wasn't until radiation alarms at a Swedish nuclear plant detected unusual activity that the Soviet government was forced to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. Finally, more than a day after the explosion, evacuation orders were given for Pripyat. Residents were told that they had only a few hours to gather their belongings. They were reassured that they would be able to return soon, but in reality, none of them would ever see their homes again. The evacuation was rushed, with long lines of buses stretching down the roads, carrying thousands of people away from the growing nuclear crisis. The eerie silence that followed would mark the beginning of Pripyat's transformation into an abandoned city, frozen in time. Even after the residents were removed, the danger remained. The destroyed reactor was still emitting dangerous amounts of radiation, threatening to spread even further. The Soviet government now faced the impossible task of stopping an ongoing nuclear disaster with limited knowledge, outdated equipment, and workers who had no idea what they were stepping into. The next phase of the response would require unprecedented human sacrifice, as thousands of people were sent into Chernobyl's radioactive ruins to prevent an even greater catastrophe. In the days following the explosion, Soviet authorities faced an overwhelming crisis. With Reactor 4 still spewing radioactive material into the air, the priority was to contain the spread before it reached catastrophic levels. However, with radiation levels so high that even machines failed, the task fell largely to human workers, thousands of whom would later be known as the Liquidators. These Liquidators were made up of soldiers, firefighters, plant workers, and volunteers, many of whom had little to no understanding of the dangers they were walking into. They were tasked with clearing debris, disposing of contaminated materials, and constructing makeshift barriers to slow the release of radiation. Some were even ordered to shovel highly radioactive graphite off the reactor roof, a task so dangerous that they were only allowed to work for seconds at a time before being replaced. Even with such short exposure, many suffered from acute radiation poisoning. One of the most urgent threats was the risk of a second explosion. Below the damaged reactor, a massive pool of molten nuclear fuel was burning through the concrete foundation. If it reached the large water reservoirs beneath the plant, the resulting steam explosion could have been powerful enough to contaminate much of Europe with lethal radiation. To prevent this, a group of 3 engineers and plant workers volunteered for a near-suicidal mission, diving into the flooded basement to drain the water manually. Their efforts succeeded, preventing what could have been an even greater catastrophe. At the same time, Soviet scientists and engineers worked to construct a massive concrete structure, known as the sarcophagus, to encase the reactor and limit further radiation release. It was a rushed effort, built under extreme conditions, and it would later require major reinforcement. But at the time, it was seen as the only viable solution to stop the crisis from spiraling further out of control. As the response continued, the Soviet government finally admitted to the world that an accident had occurred. However, the full scale of the disaster was still downplayed. Only after increased radiation was detected in other countries did more details start to emerge. International pressure grew, forcing the Soviet Union to take more drastic action. Scientists and nuclear experts from around the world offered assistance, but political tensions made collaboration difficult. Meanwhile, the effects of radiation exposure were beginning to take a toll. Hospitals became overwhelmed with liquidators and first responders suffering from radiation sickness. Many of these individuals had no idea they had been exposed until symptoms appeared: burns on their skin, organ failure, and in many cases, fatal complications. Despite the growing crisis, thousands more workers were sent to continue the cleanup, some with little more than cloth masks and basic protective suits. By this point, the abandoned city of Pripyat had become a haunting reminder of the disaster. Houses, schools, and amusement parks sat untouched, frozen in time. Personal belongings were left behind as residents had expected to return. Over time, nature began reclaiming the city, but the radiation levels remained dangerously high. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer just a Soviet problem, it had become an international concern. Scientists and world leaders debated how to prevent similar disasters in the future, but the full consequences of Chernobyl were still unfolding. The disaster's impact on human health, the environment, and even politics would continue to grow in the months and years ahead. As the months passed, the full scale of the Chernobyl disaster became clearer. The radiation released into the environment was not just a local problem. It spread across vast regions, carried by the wind and contaminating land, water, and food supplies far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Belarus, in particular, suffered heavily, with large portions of its farmland becoming unsafe due to radioactive fallout. Even areas in Western Europe detected elevated radiation levels, forcing some countries to take drastic measures, such as banning the sale of contaminated food products. One of the most alarming long-term consequences was the impact on human health. While many of the liquidators and first responders suffered immediate effects from radiation exposure, the true cost of the disaster would be measured over generations. Increased cases of thyroid cancer, particularly in children, became one of the most well-documented health effects. This was largely due to the release of radioactive iodine, which was absorbed by the thyroid gland through contaminated milk and other food sources. In response, medical studies were launched to track the long-term health effects of radiation exposure, with scientists trying to understand how deeply Chernobyl had altered human DNA. Birth defects, immune system disorders, and other illnesses were reported among populations exposed to high levels of radiation, but the full impact remains debated to this day. The Soviet government and later the Ukrainian government set up programs to provide compensation and healthcare to victims, but resources were often limited. Meanwhile, the long and complicated process of decontaminating the affected areas had begun. Entire villages were abandoned with buildings demolished and soil removed in an attempt to reduce radiation levels. In some cases, entire forests were bulldozed and buried because the trees had absorbed dangerous amounts of radiation. The exclusion zone, covering thousands of square miles around the plant, became a permanent no-go area with only a few elderly residents choosing to return despite the risks. Wildlife in the exclusion zone also faced major consequences. Many animals showed signs of genetic mutations, while others, including birds and large mammals, struggled to survive in the altered environment. Over time, however, something unexpected happened. Nature began to reclaim the abandoned land. With no human interference, populations of wolves, bears, and other wildlife started to thrive, creating a strange paradox. An area once deemed too dangerous for humans became a haven for animals. Despite these changes, the damaged reactor remained a major concern. The hastily built sarcophagus that covered Reactor 4 was not designed to last forever, and over the years, cracks and structural weaknesses began to appear. If it collapsed, radioactive dust could once again be released into the air, causing another environmental crisis. To prevent this, an international effort was launched to build a new containment structure, one of the largest engineering projects ever undertaken. Known as the New Safe Confinement, this massive steel structure was designed to completely enclose Reactor 4 and prevent further radiation leaks. It was carefully constructed and then slid into place over the existing sarcophagus, a feat that required precise planning and execution. This new barrier was designed to last for at least a century, buying time for future generations to find a permanent solution to the dangers posed by the reactor's remains. Even with these efforts, Chernobyl remains an ongoing challenge. The disaster reshaped nuclear policy worldwide, leading to stricter safety regulations and renewed debates about the risks of nuclear power. Some countries moved away from nuclear energy entirely, while others doubled down on improving safety measures. The lessons of Chernobyl continue to influence discussions about energy, safety, and government transparency, ensuring that its legacy will not be forgotten. Decades after the Chernobyl disaster, its impact is still being felt in ways both seen and unseen. While the exclusion zone remains largely uninhabited, scientists, researchers, and even tourists visit the area to study its long-term effects and witness the eerie remains of what was once a thriving community. Pripyat, the abandoned city near to the power plant, stands frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the sudden evacuation that took place all those years ago. Buildings crumble, nature overtakes the streets, and personal belongings remain scattered as if waiting for their owners to return. Despite ongoing concerns about radiation, Chernobyl has also become a site of great interest for scientists studying how ecosystems adapt to extreme conditions. Wildlife has flourished in the absence of human activity, with some species showing resilience to radiation exposure. While mutations and shortened lifespans have been observed in certain animals, others appear to be thriving, raising new questions about nature's ability to recover from nuclear disasters. At the same time, there is still no clear solution for dealing with the long-term storage of nuclear waste from the disaster. While the new safe confinement structure provides a temporary solution for Reactor 4, the question remains what will happen when it, too, reaches the end of its lifespan. The effort to decommission the plant and safely manage its radioactive materials will continue for generations, requiring constant attention and funding. The people most affected by Chernobyl, those who were evacuated, the liquidators who risked their lives, and the families who lost loved ones, continue to fight for recognition and support. Some survivors still struggle with health problems linked to radiation exposure, while others have spent years advocating for justice and better assistance. The disaster exposed the dangers of government secrecy and the consequences of ignoring safety concerns, lessons that many believe should never be forgotten. Chernobyl also serves as a warning for the future of nuclear energy. While advances in technology have made modern reactors safer, the disaster remains a symbol of what can go wrong when human error, flawed designs, and poor decision-making collide. The event changed the way the world viewed nuclear power, leading some nations to phase it out, while others work to improve safety standards. The debate over nuclear energy's risks and benefits continues, shaped in part by the haunting legacy of Chernobyl. Though decades have passed, the Chernobyl disaster remains a powerful reminder of how one moment in history can alter the course of the future. The lessons learned from this tragedy have influenced global policies, scientific research, and public awareness about the dangers of radiation and the need for transparency in times of crisis. While efforts to contain and manage the site continue, the story of Chernobyl will always stand as a cautionary tale, one that must never be ignored or forgotten.